Alright, it's time to talk about political power and territoriality, y'all, and it's a saucy one, so if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. So let's start with a definition, as is our custom. When we talk about political power, we mean the control states assert over their people, their resources, and their territory. And there are several phenomena that explain the spatial distribution of political power that we see on the world map, and just for poops and giggles, I'll give you three. The first spatial phenomenon that explains the distribution of political power is the presence of shatter belts. Now, shatter belts refer to groups of politically and ethnically fragmented states located between larger, more powerful states that often vie for control over those smaller states. Now, those larger states don't just invade and try to control these shatter belt regions for funsies. No, usually shatter belt regions are home to some valuable natural resource that those larger states want to get their grubby hands on. And what makes this situation precarious is that shatter belt states are usually underdeveloped and refuse to cooperate with the demands of larger, more powerful states. And it might be underselling it to say that things can get contentious around shatter belts. In fact, one of the most famous shatter belts is the Balkan states in Southeast Europe, which is the home to many different rival ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups. And it was various world powers making alliances with these different unstable states that ultimately led to the outbreak of World War I. And then since World War II, political geographers have identified four main regions in which shatter belts exist, as you can see right here. Okay, now the second phenomenon that explains the spatial distribution of political power is the presence of choke points. Now, by definition, these are narrow, highly strategic geographic passageways that restrict passage from one region to another. And because controlling these choke points can be a source of enormous economic gain, states battle over control of these territories, and I'll introduce you to two of these by example. First is the Strait of Hormuz, which is controlled by Iran and acts as a major choke point for the global oil trade. Like all the major oil exporting nations like Iraq and Kuwait and Bahrain and several others rely on easy passage through this strait if they're going to sell their oil on the global market. But on occasion, when Iran didn't like the way things were going in the region, they put their power pants on and threatened to close the strait down. So the point is, control of this strategic location gives Iran a dose of political power on the world stage that they would not have if not for control of this little waterway. Okay, a second example of a choke point you should know is the Suez Canal in Egypt. Now, this sweet little bippy is massively important for European and Asian countries trading with each other because it removes the necessity to travel all the way around the giant honking African continent. Now, this human-built waterway was variously controlled by the French and the British during the colonial era until 1956, when Egyptian authorities decided they wanted to control the canal for themselves. I mean, can you imagine, like a sovereign state wanting to control a strategic canal that's within their own borders so they could benefit economically? So rude. Well, Britain and France decided it was rude enough to invade Egypt and try to wrest control of the canal back for themselves. And over the course of decades, this fight closed the canal on several occasions, but today it remains under the political control of Egypt. Okay, now the third major phenomenon that explains the distribution of political power is neocolonialism. So although nearly all former colonies have become independent nations and the old kind of colonialism isn't really practiced anymore, a new kind of colonialism has arisen. Neocolonialism describes the process by which powerful countries attempt to control weaker countries through economic or cultural pressure. And we can see this today, especially in Africa, but to understand that, let's back up and get some context. So remember from the last video that European powers raced to claim as much of Africa as they could in what became known as the Scramble for Africa. And whatever territory each power claimed, they reorganized the economies of those places to serve European interests. And the way they did that was to organize African colonial economies almost exclusively on the export of various cash crops like palm oil or cocoa beans. And these exports were shipped exclusively to their colonial parents at low prices. Additionally, much of the trade that occurred between various African countries was altogether stopped, which further hindered the development of the colonial economy. Okay, so fast forward about 80 years and we see a massive wave of decolonization after World War II in Africa and throughout the world. But because African economies have been malformed to only serve the interest of European powers, even after their independence, they continue to rely on those economic partnerships. And that reliance has kept many African states underdeveloped and dependent on former colonial power. And this kind of relationship has been explained under the heading of dependency theory, which argues that one of the main consequences of the colonial era today is that former colonies remain dependent on greater powers in order to survive. Okay, so now let's finish up by talking about territoriality, which is intimately bound up with the concept of political power. So by definition, territoriality describes a people's connection and claim to a particular piece of land. And when people have a sense of connection to a geographic space, there's a simultaneous desire to draw boundaries around that space in order to control what goes on there. For example, the Soviet Union controlled much of the territory in Eastern Europe before its fall in 1991, including the now independent country of Ukraine. However, Russian leaders like Vladimir Putin, under the influence of territoriality and the sense that Ukraine still belonged to Russia, has initiated several conflicts with Ukraine in order to annex parts of its territory back into Russia. So that sense of territoriality and the desire to draw boundaries around a piece of land has often led to conflict and war, which in many cases has altered the boundaries of various countries around the world. Okay, click here to keep reviewing for Unit 4 and click here to get your hands on my video note guides, which are going to help you follow along with my videos and get the contents of this course firmly crammed into your brain folds. And I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.